The city bustled with its usual rhythm, the streets alive with a cacophony of honking cars, the chatter of pedestrians, and the hum of buses weaving through the urban sprawl. Inside one of those buses, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow on the diverse array of passengers. Some were engrossed in their phones, others stared out the window, lost in thought, while a few engaged in hushed conversations, their words blending into the background hum of tires rolling over asphalt. Among the passengers sat an older man, Mr. Benson. His grey hair and weathered face hinted at a life filled with stories untold, lessons learned, and struggles endured. He held a worn cane in his hand, gripping it tightly, as if it was both a necessity and a reminder of his resilience. His eyes, though tired, sparkled with a calm wisdom, surveying the bus with quiet detachment. Not far from him stood Jason, a young man in his early 20s, dressed in a red hoodie that matched his restless energy. His sharp gaze darted around the crowded bus until it fixed on Mr. Benson, seated calmly in the middle. Jason's legs ached from a long day, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. He clenched his fists and took a step closer, his irritation growing with each bump of the bus. "Hey, that's my seat, sir," Jason snapped, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the passengers. Heads turned toward the sudden commotion, curiosity sparking in their eyes. The air seemed to grow heavier, the once innocuous chatter replaced by an uneasy silence. Mr. Benson looked up slowly, his face calm, but tinged with disbelief. He tilted his head slightly, studying the young man with a mixture of surprise and mild amusement. "Excuse me," he said, his voice even and steady. "This seat is not reserved. Perhaps you could find another." Jason's jaw tightened, his frustration boiling over. "I said that's my seat," he repeated, louder this time. "I've been standing all day. Get up. Now." The tension rippled through the bus like a wave. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers barely audible. "Can you believe this guy?" one murmured. "The nerve," another muttered, shaking their head. Mr. Benson tightened his grip on his cane, his knuckles whitening, but his expression remained calm. "Young man," he said, his voice firm, but not unkind. "I've had this seat since I got on the bus. If you're tired, perhaps someone else might offer you theirs." Jason's face turned red with indignation, and he leaned closer, pointing aggressively at the seat. "Oh, so now you're too good to move, huh?" he mocked. "Sitting there, like you own the place, while I'm standing here. Unbelievable." A mother pulled her child closer, the little one peeking out from behind her arm. An elderly woman shook her head in disapproval. The bus driver glanced in the rearview mirror, but he remained silent, his attention returning to the road. Jason's voice grew louder, filling the bus with his frustration. "I'm not asking again. Get up." Mr. Benson exhaled deeply, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Respect your elders, son," he said, his tone resolute. "You'll have plenty of chances to sit in life. Learn to stand now." The words hung in the air like a challenge, silencing Jason momentarily. But his pride refused to back down. He threw his arms up in exasperation, turning to the passengers as if seeking validation. "Can you all believe this guy? Sitting there like it's his throne. Who even does that?" A murmur of disapproval rose from the passengers, one voice cutting through the others. "You're the one causing the scene," a middle-aged man said, his tone sharp. Jason spun around to face him, his frustration boiling over. "What did you just say?" Jason barked, his voice trembling with anger. The man met his gaze without flinching. "I said, if you're so tired, sit somewhere else. There are plenty of other spots." Jason glared at him, his defiance momentarily faltering. Then he turned back to Mr. Benson, his anger reigniting. "I'm not letting this go," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I'll stand here all day if I have to." Mr. Benson sighed, his steady gaze meeting Jason's fiery one. "Do what you must," he replied. "I'm not moving. I've lived too long, worked too hard, and raised too many children to be bullied out of a seat." The bus grew silent again, the tension palpable. Jason hesitated, his aggressive posture faltering slightly. Before he could respond, a young woman stepped forward. Her name was Lucy, and her calm confidence radiated as she spoke. "Hey, maybe you should leave him alone," she said, her voice cutting through the thick tension. "He's clearly not moving, and honestly, you're embarrassing yourself." Jason turned to her, his anger redirected. "Stay out of this," he snapped. "This is between me and him." Lucy crossed her arms, her expression unimpressed. "No, it's not," she retorted. "It's between you and your ego." A ripple of chuckles spread through the bus, the passengers finding a moment of levity in the tense situation. Jason's face flushed with anger and humiliation, his stance faltering further. He turned back to Mr. Benson, lowering his voice to a growl. "Listen here, old man. I'm not playing games. You're getting up, or I'll make you." The bus went silent, even the hum of the engine seeming to fade. All eyes were on the two men, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Mr. Benson's gaze remained steady as he spoke, his voice slow and deliberate. "Son," he said, "life is full of choices. You can choose to keep acting like this and show everyone the worst of yourself, or you can sit down, learn some patience, and maybe even grow up a little. The choice is yours." Jason froze, the weight of Mr. Benson's words sinking in deeper than he expected. Around them, passengers nodded in quiet agreement, the unspoken judgment heavy in the air. Lucy smirked slightly, adding, "He's right, you know. Be better." Jason's shoulders slumped, his defiance giving way to a flicker of doubt. The bus rocked gently as it continued its journey, but the moment hung suspended in time, unresolved and laden with tension. Jason stood in the aisle, his face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. The bus rocked slightly as it made its way through the bustling city streets, but the young man barely noticed. His mind churned, replaying the exchange with Mr. Benson over and over. How had this old man, sitting so calmly with his cane, managed to make him feel so small? Jason clenched his fists at his sides, his pride refusing to let him back down, even as the whispers and sideways glances from the other passengers nodded him. Lucy returned to her seat, but her eyes lingered on Jason for a moment longer. Her words had cut through his bravado earlier, and she could see the cracks beginning to form in his defiance. Still, she knew better than to push too hard. People like Jason didn't change in an instant. It took time and sometimes a little more humiliation than they were ready to endure. The other passengers, sensing that the immediate confrontation had subsided, returned to their routines. A woman scrolled through her phone, pretending not to notice the tension lingering in the air. A man near the front adjusted his tie and checked his watch, clearly eager to reach his destination. But the mood on the bus had shifted. The argument had left an impression, and now a quiet curiosity hung over the passengers. Jason finally slumped against the metal pole near the middle of the bus, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He glared out the window, watching the city blur past. Every honk of a car horn, every hiss of the bus brakes, seemed to amplify the frustration simmering inside him. Why had he let it go this far? Why couldn't he just let it go? His thoughts drifted back to earlier in the day. It had been a long one, filled with missed opportunities and minor setbacks that had built up into a mountain of frustration. Jason worked as a delivery driver, a job he didn't particularly enjoy but needed to make ends meet. Today had been worse than usual: traffic jams, late deliveries, and an argument with his boss that had left him seething. He hadn't eaten lunch, and his back ached from hours of standing and bending. By the time he got on the bus, all he wanted was to sit down and tune out the world. But instead of finding relief, he'd found Mr. Benson, sitting there with that infuriating calmness, refusing to give up his seat. Jason's stomach twisted as he realized how petty his behavior must have looked to everyone on the bus. Yet, even now, his pride wouldn't let him admit he was wrong. He told himself he was standing on principle, that he deserved the seat after the kind of day he'd had. Mr. Benson, meanwhile, gazed out the window, his expression unreadable, but inside his mind was far from calm. The encounter with Jason had stirred memories he hadn't thought about in years. He could still recall the days when he was young and hot-headed, much like the young man now glaring out at the city streets. Back then, he'd let his temper get the better of him more times than he cared to admit. It had taken years of hard lessons, some painful, others humbling, for him to learn patience and restraint. As the bus rattled on, Mr. Benson glanced down at his cane, tracing the worn wood with his fingers. It had been a gift from his late wife, a woman whose kindness and wisdom had been his anchor through the stormiest parts of his life. She had always been the one to remind him to think before he acted, to treat others with compassion, even when it wasn't easy. Her voice echoed in his mind now, soft and steady. Osterisks teach by example, not by force. The ones who need it most are often the ones who resist the hardest. Asterisk. Lucy watched Jason from the corner of her eye. Her curiosity piqued. She didn't know much about him, but something about his anger felt familiar. She had seen it before in herself. A few years ago, she had been just as quick to snap at people, just as defensive when things didn't go her way. It wasn't until a friend had called her out, challenging her to take a hard look at herself, that she begun to change. Now, watching Jason, she wondered if he was at a similar crossroads. The bus slowed to a stop, and a handful of passengers disembarked. Jason shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flickering toward Mr. Benson, who still sat serenely in the same spot. The older man hadn't said a word since his last pointed remark, but his silence seemed to speak volumes. Jason could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, a constant reminder of his earlier outburst. As more people got off the bus, several empty seats opened up, but Jason didn't move. He stood stubbornly in the aisle, arms still crossed, as if sitting now would be an admission of defeat. He caught a glimpse of Lucy looking at him and quickly averted his eyes, the heat rising in his cheeks. Lucy sighed quietly, shaking her head. She leaned over to her friend, who sat beside her, and whispered, "Think he'll learn anything from this?" Her friend shrugged, glancing at Jason with mild curiosity. Hard to say. Some people need to hit rock bottom before they wake up. Jason couldn't hear their words, but he could feel their scrutiny. It only added to the knot of frustration tightening in his chest. He hated feeling like he was under a microscope, like everyone on the bus was judging him. But deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were right to do so. The bus driver glanced in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowing slightly as he took in the tension lingering in the back. He had seen his fair share of arguments during his years behind the wheel, and he knew how quickly things could escalate. For now, he decided to let it play out, keeping one eye on the road and the other on the passengers. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace. Skyscrapers loomed overhead, their glass facades reflecting the late afternoon sun. People hurried along the sidewalks, weaving through the crowd with determined focus. The bus rolled past a park where children played on swings, their laughter momentarily cutting through the tension inside. Jason caught sight of the park and felt a pang of nostalgia. He remembered going there as a kid with his mother, who had always told him to be polite and respectful to others. She had worked long hours to support them, often coming home exhausted, but still finding time to teach him the values she held dear. Jason's stomach churned as he realized how disappointed she would be if she could see him now. But even as guilt began to creep in, Jason's stubborn pride fought back. He straightened his shoulders, refusing to let himself dwell on the past. Instead, he focused on the here and now, on the standoff that had turned the entire bus into an unspoken battleground. Mr. Benson shifted slightly in his seat, his cane tapping softly against the floor. He could sense the young man's inner turmoil, even without looking directly at him. He had seen it before in others, and years ago in himself. There was a time when he might have handled this situation differently, with anger or impatience. But now he knew better. Sometimes the best way to teach a lesson was simply to hold your ground and let the other person come to their own realization. As the bus turned onto a quieter street, the tension remained unresolved, hanging heavy in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Each passenger felt it in their own way, the weight of the confrontation leaving an imprint that wouldn't soon fade. For Jason, it was a moment of reckoning he hadn't anticipated. For Mr. Benson, it was another chapter in a lifetime of standing firm in the face of adversity. And for the rest of the passengers, it was a reminder of the silent battles people fight every day. On buses, in offices, in homes, and in hearts. Jason couldn't shake the weight of the stairs anymore. Though most of the passengers had gone back to their own thoughts and distractions, he felt as though every single pair of eyes on the bus was still judging him. He shifted on his feet, gripping the metal pole tighter than necessary, his knuckles pale. His earlier indignation was beginning to crumble, replaced by a creeping unease that made it hard to keep his gaze steady. Mr. Benson, for his part, remained quiet, his hands resting lightly on the curved handle of his cane. His posture, straight yet relaxed, conveyed a confidence that seemed unshakable. He wasn't trying to antagonize Jason. He simply wasn't budging. This wasn't a power struggle for him. It was a matter of principle. He'd lived long enough to know when to let things slide and when to stand firm. This was the latter. Lucy, who had been keeping a casual watch on the scene, leaned slightly toward her seatmate again. "He hasn't moved," she murmured, tilting her head toward Jason. Her friend nodded, barely looking up from her phone. Of course he hasn't. Guys like him are too proud to back down, even when they're clearly in the wrong. Lucy's expression softened as she studied Jason's profile. Something about the way he stood, tense but not aggressive, his jaw tight, but his shoulders beginning to sag, made her wonder if he was feeling the sting of regret. She had been there once, after all. She'd been the one trying to save face, even when every fiber of her being told her she should apologize. Jason exhaled sharply and muttered under his breath, just loud enough for himself to hear. "Why do I even care? It's just a stupid seat." But he did care. Not about the seat, really, at least not anymore. What bothered him now was the way everything had spiraled. It wasn't just the old man's calm defiance or the subtle digs from Lucy. It was the unspoken judgment in the air, the way his pride had trapped him in a fight he didn't even want anymore. In the back of the bus, a young boy squirmed in his seat beside his mother. "Mom," he whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "Why is that man standing there like that?" His mother leaned down and gave him a quick smile, her voice low and reassuring. Sometimes people just need a little time to figure things out. Jason heard the exchange and glanced over his shoulder. The boy's curious eyes met his for a brief moment before the mother gently turned him back toward the window. Jason's chest tightened. It was one thing to feel the judgment of adults. He could brush that off. But the innocent, unfiltered gaze of a child, that cut deeper. The bus driver, who had been monitoring the situation in the rearview mirror, finally spoke up. "Everyone okay back there?" His tone was casual, but carried an edge of authority. The question hung in the air for a moment before Lucy answered for the group. "We're fine, just a little drama." She smiled lightly, her words easing some of the tension, but not dispelling it entirely. Jason let out a soft huff, his frustration bubbling up again. "Drama," he muttered under his breath. "That's what this is to everyone, huh?" He wasn't sure why he said it out loud. Maybe he wanted someone to hear, to understand that this wasn't just about a seat. Not really. But Lucy heard him. She turned slightly, her expression curious but not unkind. "What do you think it is then?" she asked, her voice low enough that only Jason could hear. He blinked, caught off guard by the question. For a moment, he considered brushing her off, snapping back with something sharp and dismissive. But the genuine interest in her tone stopped him. She wasn't mocking him. She wanted an answer. Jason hesitated, his grip on the pole loosening. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice quieter than he intended. "I guess it's everything. Today's been one of those days, you know. And then this, it just..." He stopped, shaking his head. "Forget it. Doesn't matter." Lucy watched him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I get that," she said simply, leaning back in her seat. She didn't push him to elaborate, didn't try to fix anything. She just let the words hang there, giving him the space he hadn't realized he needed. Meanwhile, Mr. Benson was thinking too. Though his expression remained composed, his thoughts wandered to his own younger days. He remembered a time when he'd been in Jason's shoes. Angry, defensive, and too proud to admit when he was wrong. He lost friends, opportunities, even a job once because of his stubbornness. But he also been lucky enough to have people in his life who had called him out, who had made him see himself in ways he didn't want to. That was why he hadn't escalated the confrontation with Jason. He saw something in the young man, a chance for him to grow, if only he could get out of his own way. The bus turned a corner, the sunlight streaming through the windows, shifting with the movement. Jason noticed the empty seats again, the way they seemed to beckon him. All he had to do was sit down. The fight would be over, but something inside him resisted. If he sat now, it would feel like giving up, like admitting he'd been wrong all along. And yet, wasn't that exactly what he needed to do? Lucy's voice broke through his thoughts again, this time louder. You know, sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing. But it's also the thing that gets you out of your own head. Jason turned to look at her, his brow furrowing. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, his tone defensive, but not as sharp as before. She shrugged. Just that it's okay to let go. No one's keeping score except you. The words hit Jason harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to argue, but found he couldn't. Instead, he looked back at Mr. Benson, who was now watching him with a calm, steady gaze. For the first time, Jason saw something in the older man's eyes, not defiance, not judgment, but understanding. It made his chest ache in a way he didn't quite understand. The bus slowed to another stop, and more passengers got off, thinning the crowd even further. Jason glanced around, noticing how much space there was now. He could sit anywhere, but he didn't move. Not yet. Something kept him rooted to the spot, the weight of the unspoken tension still holding him back. As the bus doors closed and it pulled away from the curb, Jason let out a slow breath. He didn't know what he was going to do next, but for the first time he felt like maybe he didn't have to figure it out alone. The bus rattled slightly as it hit a small bump in the road, jolting Jason out of his thoughts. His eyes darted toward Mr. Benson again. The older man remained still, his gaze now fixed on the horizon beyond the window, as if he was entirely unaffected by the lingering tension. That calmness, that unwavering steadiness. It gnawed at Jason in a way he couldn't explain. Why wasn't this man more upset? Why hadn't he reacted with anger or frustration? It felt like a silent rebuke, more effective than any shouting match could have been. Jason tightened his grip on the pole, the cool metal grounding him in the moment. He could feel the sweat on his palms, and a dull ache building in his shoulders from standing so rigidly for so long. The tension in the air was suffocating, and he could sense the passengers around him waiting, watching, expecting something to happen. He hated how their judgment seemed to press down on him, heavy and unavoidable. Yet a small, nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered that their judgment wasn't entirely undeserved. Lucy, sitting a few rows back, exchanged a glance with her friend. She could see Jason's inner struggle etched on his face, the way his jaw clenched and unclenched, the way his shoulders occasionally twitched as if he were debating whether to move or stay frozen in place. She leaned toward her friend and whispered, "He's going to crack soon. You can see it." Her friend shrugged, scrolling through her phone. Maybe, or maybe he's just stubborn enough to stand there until we all get off the bus. Lucy frowned, her gaze lingering on Jason. I don't think it's just stubbornness. There's something else going on. Jason wasn't sure how much longer he could endure the silence. Every creak of the bus, every murmur from the other passengers, every glance cast in his direction felt like a challenge. He wanted to lash out again, to reclaim some semblance of control over the situation, but something held him back. His mind kept circling back to Mr. Benson's words. Asterisk, respect your elders. You'll have plenty of chances to sit in life. Learn to stand now. Asterisk. The words echoed in his head, not just as a rebuke, but as a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Was it really about respect? Or was it something deeper, something Jason had been missing? He glanced down at the floor, his sneakers scuffed and worn from too many restless days. He thought about his own father, who used to say similar things, short, simple phrases that carried more weight than Jason cared to admit at the time. He hadn't thought about those lessons in years, and now they surfaced unbidden, making his chest feel tight. Mr. Benson shifted slightly in his seat, his cane tapping softly against the floor. Jason's eyes flicked up, catching the movement. The older man's gaze met his for the briefest of moments, and Jason felt a wave of something he couldn't quite name, shame, maybe, or recognition. It was as if Mr. Benson could see straight through him, past the bravado and the anger, to something raw and vulnerable underneath. Jason looked away quickly, his heart pounding. The bus driver's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the next stop. A few more passengers rose from their seats, shuffling toward the doors. Jason's eyes followed them, tempted for a fleeting second to join them, to escape the suffocating tension and leave his whole mess behind. But he didn't move. His feet felt glued to the floor, and some stubborn part of him refused to walk away before something, anything, changed. Lucy sighed softly, crossing her arms as she watched the scene unfold. She'd seen enough in her life to recognize when someone was teetering on the edge of a decision that could define them. Jason wasn't just angry. He was conflicted, caught between who he was and who he wanted to be. She leaned back, deciding to let him figure it out on his own. Sometimes, people needed to come to their own conclusions. The silence on the bus grew heavier, the kind that made every small noise, every cough, every creak of the seats feel amplified. Jason's frustration boiled under the surface, but it wasn't directed at Mr. Benson anymore. It wasn't even about the seat. It was about something much bigger, something Jason hadn't allowed himself to confront until now. He thought about his day, his week even, the mounting pressures, the endless string of small humiliations that had left him feeling powerless and unseen. The seat had been a symbol, a chance to take something back, to feel like he mattered. But now, standing there, he realized how hollow that victory would have been. Mr. Benson shifted again, this time leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on the cane. He didn't say anything, but his presence felt louder than words. Jason's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence, but his throat felt constricted. The bus hit another bump, and Jason stumbled slightly, his hands slipping on the pole. He caught himself quickly, but not before a soft chuckle rippled through the seats behind him. His face burned, and he clenched his fists, his pride screaming at him to lash out. But instead, he took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs shakily. Lucy leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "You okay?" she asked, the question carrying a weight that went beyond the stumble. Jason nodded without looking at her, his jaw tight. "Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. Mr. Benson's gaze remained steady, and Jason could feel it even without looking directly at him. The older man wasn't gloating, wasn't smirking in victory. If anything, his expression was one of quiet encouragement, as if he was waiting for Jason to take the next step. The bus slowed again, nearing another stop. Jason's heart raced, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He could feel the moment reaching its breaking point, the tension building to something inevitable. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't keep standing still. As the bus came to a gentle stop, the doors hissed open, and a few more passengers stepped off. The air felt lighter for a moment, but the underlying tension remained, hanging between Jason and Mr. Benson like a taut string. Jason shifted his weight, his sneakers squeaking softly against the floor, his thoughts still a tangled mess. He had been standing there so long that his legs were beginning to ache, but pride and stubbornness rooted him in place. Just as the bus began moving again, an unexpected sound broke the quiet. A deep guttural cough that came from Mr. Benson. It was sudden and sharp, cutting through the stillness like a crack of thunder. Jason's eyes snapped toward the older man, and for the first time he noticed something he hadn't before. Mr. Benson looked pale. His hands trembled slightly as they gripped the change in Mr. Benson, and a faint sheen of sweat didn't go unnoticed by the other passengers. Lucy furrowed her brow, leaning forward as if to get a better look. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Mr. Benson waved her off weakly, attempting a faint smile. "I'm fine, dear," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier strength. "Just a little tired, that's all." Jason felt a pang of unease twist in his chest. For all his frustration earlier, he hadn't considered that the man might not just be stubborn. He might genuinely need that seat. The realization hit him like a brick, and he suddenly felt foolish for his earlier outburst. But even as guilt began to creep in, Jason hesitated. Was this a moment to step back, or was it something else entirely? Lucy wasn't convinced by Mr. Benson's reassurance. She stood up from her seat and walked toward him, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "You don't look fine," she said gently. "Maybe you should let someone know if you're not feeling well." "I said I'm fine," Mr. Benson replied firmly, though his voice cracked slightly. He shifted in his seat, trying to adjust himself, but the movement only seemed to emphasize his discomfort. Jason's heart thudded in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. For the first time, he noticed how frail the older man really was. The cane wasn't just an accessory, it was a necessity. And now, seeing Mr. Benson struggling to maintain his composure, Jason felt a wave of shame wash over him. How had he missed this before? How had he let his anger blind him to the reality of the situation? But before Jason could process these thoughts, another voice cut through the tension, a man's voice from the back of the bus. "Hey, is everything okay up there?" He called out, his tone tinged with concern. The passengers turned to look, and Jason caught sight of a middle-aged man standing near the rear doors. His presence added a new layer to the moment, and Jason felt the weight of even more eyes on him. Lucy glanced at the man before addressing the bus driver. "I think this gentleman might need some help," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The bus driver, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, glanced in the rearview mirror and sighed. "We're a few stops from the station. If it's serious, I can call for someone when we get there," he said. Mr. Benson shook his head, his voice steadier now as he tried to assert himself. "No need for all that," he insisted. "I'm just an old man who needs a moment to catch his breath." But Jason could see it now. This wasn't just a moment. Something was off, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. His pride, his frustration, his earlier argument with Mr. Benson, all of it faded into the background as a new sense of urgency took hold. And then, just as the bus passed through a busy intersection, Mr. Benson coughed again, harder this time, his hand clutching his chest briefly before he quickly tried to cover it up. The air in the bus shifted, a collective unease rippling through the passengers. Lucy turned to Jason, her eyes narrowing. "You've been standing here this whole time, arguing over a seat," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "Maybe now's the time to do something that actually matters." Jason's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. He looked at Mr. Benson, who met his gaze with a tired but knowing look. The older man didn't say anything, but the silence spoke volumes. Jason could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, demanding a choice. Would he hold on to his pride, or would he finally let go? Just as Jason took a step forward, the bus jolted slightly, causing Mr. Benson to sway in his seat. Lucy reached out instinctively to steady him, and Jason felt his stomach twist. He knew he couldn't stand idly by any more. But before he could act, the bus driver's voice came over the intercom again. "Hold tight, folks. We've got some traffic up ahead," the driver said, his tone casual, oblivious to the tension brewing inside the bus. Jason's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, every whisper that passed between the passengers. But this time, the pressure didn't feel suffocating. It felt like a call to action. Taking a deep breath, he turned toward Mr. Benson, his voice low but steady. "Sir, do you want me to call someone? Or should we get you to a doctor or something?" Mr. Benson looked up at him, his expression softening just slightly. "No need for all that, son," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I've seen worse days than this. Just let me sit for a while longer." Jason nodded, his chest tightening. He wanted to argue, to insist that Mr. Benson needed more help than he was letting on, but the older man's resolve stopped him. And yet, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, something he didn't fully understand yet. The bus slowed to another stop, and Jason glanced at Lucy, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. The moment felt heavier than any he had faced before, and he knew it was far from over. The stakes had shifted, and the tension in the air was sharper than ever, cutting into him with every passing second. As the bus rolled forward, the air inside felt charged, every passenger holding their breath in quiet anticipation. Jason stood rooted in place, his eyes flicking from Mr. Benson to Lucy and back again. The older man's pale complexion and faint trembling hadn't gone unnoticed, and Jason could no longer ignore the uneasy churn in his gut. Yet, just as he was about to speak, Mr. Benson shifted in his seat, straightening slightly. "I'll be all right," Mr. Benson said softly, his voice carrying a weary strength. He tapped his cane lightly against the floor, as if reassuring not just the others but himself. "I've handled worse. This isn't the first time someone's tested me, and it won't be the last." Jason swallowed hard, guilt swirling within him like a storm. His earlier anger and entitlement felt small now, dwarfed by the reality of the situation. But before he could fully process his emotions, the bus lurched to an abrupt halt, sending everyone jolting forward. A collective gasp rippled through the passengers, and a man's voice from the back shouted, "What's going on?" The driver's voice came over the intercom, this time more urgent. "Sorry, folks. Emergency vehicles are blocking the road ahead. We'll be stopped for a few minutes." The sudden pause heightened the tension inside the bus, and Jason felt his pulse quicken. He glanced toward the front, where flashing lights from an ambulance and police cars reflected off the windows. The stillness inside the bus was palpable, broken only by the hum of the engine and the soft murmur of worried voices. Lucy, still standing beside Mr. Benson, turned to Jason. "Now's your chance," she whispered, her tone a mix of encouragement and challenge. "Do the right thing." Jason hesitated, his mind racing. The weight of everyone's eyes on him was nothing compared to the pressure building in his own chest. Finally, he stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Sir," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. I didn't mean to make things harder for you. If there's anything I can do to help." Before he could finish, Mr. Benson lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "You're helping more than you know, son," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This moment, it's not just about me or you, it's about what we take away from it." Jason blinked, unsure how to respond. But then, as if on cue, Mr. Benson's hand slipped slightly on the armrest, and he leaned forward with a wince. The movement was subtle, but it sent a ripple of alarm through Jason and the nearby passengers. Lucy immediately crouched beside him. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with urgency. "I'll be fine," Mr. Benson replied, though his tone lacked conviction. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, empty prescription bottle. The label was faded, but the word nitroglycerin was still visible. He stared at it for a moment before sighing. "Left the refill at home," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Jason's chest tightened. He didn't know much about medicine, but he knew enough to understand the seriousness of the situation. Is that for your heart?" he asked hesitantly. Mr. Benson nodded, his expression unreadable. "Nothing to worry about," he said, though his hand trembled as he placed the bottle back into his pocket. "I just need to stay calm until we get to the station." Lucy shot Jason a pointed look, her eyes practically screaming. Do something. Jason felt his heart pound as he glanced around the bus, searching for answers. Then an idea struck him. Without overthinking, he turned to the driver. "Can you radio for paramedics? I think he needs help," Jason called out, his voice louder than he intended. The driver hesitated, glancing at Mr. Benson in the rearview mirror. "I can let them know when we stop, but they're already tied up with something outside," he said, motioning toward the flashing lights ahead. Frustration bubbled in Jason's chest. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But just as despair began to creep in, a quiet voice broke through the tension. "I have some aspirin," a woman said, standing up from her seat near the middle of the bus. She was in her late 40s, her kind face framed by dark curls. "It's not much, but it might help until we get to the station." Jason watched as she stepped forward, holding out a small pill. Mr. Benson hesitated, his pride warring with practicality, but eventually he accepted it with a grateful nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. The woman smiled warmly before returning to her seat, and Jason felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't a solution, but it was something. He looked back at Lucy, who gave him a small, approving nod. And then, just as things seemed to settle, the unexpected happened. The bus door opened, and a man in a paramedic uniform stepped inside, his face calm but focused. "We got a report of a passenger in need of assistance," he said, scanning the bus. The collective tension in the air broke as relief swept through the passengers. Jason quickly pointed toward Mr. Benson. "It's him," he said. "He might need help." The paramedic moved swiftly, crouching beside Mr. Benson and asking a series of quick questions. As the older man explained his situation, Jason stepped back, his heart still racing. He watched as the paramedic worked, checking Mr. Benson's pulse and asking for details about his medication. Minutes later, the paramedic helped Mr. Benson to his feet, supporting him as they prepared to leave the bus. Before stepping off, Mr. Benson turned to Jason, his expression calm but meaningful. "You've got a good heart, son," he said. "Don't let your temper get in the way of it." Jason nodded, unable to find the words to respond. He watched as Mr. Benson and the paramedic disappeared into the ambulance outside, the flashing lights casting long shadows on the pavement. As the bus began moving again, the tension slowly dissolved, replaced by a quiet hum of conversation. Jason sank into an empty seat, his mind racing. The older man's words echoed in his head, leaving him with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. Lucy sat down beside him, her expression soft. "You did the right thing," she said simply. Jason looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe," he said, "but I've got a lot to learn." The bus continued its journey, the city lights flickering outside the window. For Jason, the ride had been more than just a trip. It had been a lesson, one he wouldn't soon forget.